Protests calling for police reform are not dying down, and some departments are responding to those calls by pulling back on their work. A new ProPublica report looked into how police have responded to protests in the past and if crime rates were impacted when police decided to do only the bare minimum. And now, communities are asking what local mayors can do to help find a middle ground. With me now for more on his piece is Alec MacGillis. He is a ProPublica reporter covering politics and government and joins us now to talk about this. So this is great reporting, Alec. Let's talk about the terms before we get into some of the deeper parts of your piece. What exactly is police pullback, and what happens when police in fact pull back during intense protests and during times of high crime?
Police pullback is basically police deciding to some degree to stop doing proactive policing. So you're still going to be responding to calls. You'll still be, if there's a call for a shooting or a murder or an armed robbery, you're still going to go out and respond to that call. But you're going to be less aggressive about all the other sorts of police work. You're going to be less likely to, say, pull up on a crowded corner where there seems to be possible, drug dealing or other stuff going on. You're more likely just to stay in your cruiser for more of your shift. We've all seen those officers sort of sitting in their cruiser, looking at their phone. You're just going to be pulling back somewhat in that way, which in some cases in recent years does seem to have contributed, not caused necessarily, but contributed to rises in violent crime in certain cities.
So one of the challenging things, I think, about this idea of police pullback is sometimes police departments don't want to say whether or not that's happening. And determining the cause of this, if it is happening, it depends on who you ask. So in your reporting, is there a way to sort of prove that this is indeed what's happening? There is police pullback, and the various parties involved, why did they say it's happening when it is happening?
It is a very delicate subject, of course. It's interesting. It's delicate for both sides of the debate in a way, because the police often don't really like you talking about it because it suggests that they're not doing their job, that they're to some degree being, kind of self-pitying or complacent about their work. On the other hand, a lot of the activists, sort of police reform activists, don't like to talk about it that much either, because implicit in this theory is the fact that we actually do need police, and that if police stop doing their job, that bad things can come from that. But as far as trying to sort of quantify it, it's tricky. Policing there's not an exact science in how we can assess these things. So we go by a mix of numbers, declines in certain kinds of arrests. For instance, in New York City this summer, we saw a huge decline in gun arrests, which has accompanied a sharp rise in shootings in New York. But a lot of it is going to be necessarily anecdotal. It's going to be, just talking to officers about what's actually going on, about how they're doing their jobs differently. Another quantifiable thing to look at is actually manpower. A lot of these cities, the pullback comes in the form of retirements, early retirements, officers leaving for other departments. That's what we're seeing in Minneapolis, we're seeing in Seattle, we're seeing in Atlanta. So in some cases, the pullback, less police presence, is the result simply of having less manpower as a result of people quitting, rather than them sitting down on their jobs, so to speak.
It's an important point that you make, Alec. And as you know, the number of people killed in August alone, according to the New York Times, was 242. There were 242 shootings, let me say, not killed, 242 shootings in August of this year compared to last year, where we only had 91 in the month of August. The question, I guess, is, police officers and the police commanders will say that part of the reason is not police pullback, that it's because their resources are being stretched thin, particularly in wake of some of the protests that they've had to pull officers from the beat to help with the protests or to cover those protests. But I'm guessing through your reporting, sort of the truth lies in the middle. Yes, there have been shootings that have gone up in New York City. Yes, police resources are stretched thin. And perhaps a part of that is also due to police pullback, or not at all?
Yes, it's a combination of factors, definitely. It's manpower, and then it's some actual sort of conscious pullback on the part of officers in some of these cities. The it's important also to make another distinction here between generally. Generally speaking, there's been interesting research on this front. Generally speaking, just the fact that officers make fewer arrests for sort of minor crimes, kind of the broken windows policing that we talk about. Just the fact that officers are making fewer arrests in those sorts of crimes does not necessarily give rise to violence. We've seen in recent years a steady decline in those kind of arrests around the country, and that has not led to a rise in crime. What's crucial is when you have a reduction in arrests, reduction in active policing in cities that have had what are called sort of viral incidents where you had an incident of police brutality or killing, a death at police hands that gets very high profile, goes very viral, like George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, like Freddie Gray's death in Baltimore. And those incidents, when you have a pullback in policing in those situations, it seems much more heavily correlated with a rise in violence. I mean, what we saw here in Baltimore, where I live, 5 years ago, after Freddie Gray's death and the protests that followed it, was just an extraordinary surge in violence that is basically still going on now 5 years later. And what we're seeing now in some cities around the country this year that also experience viral events is certainly looks like a version of that, if somewhat less dramatic.
So what I thought was very interesting about your piece, one of the things that I thought was that sort of my takeaway was how important the relationship is between community, between police, between the mayors of these cities, how all three sort of components have to be playing a role in order to ensure that crime is manageable, that the cities are safe. And that is increasingly breaking down. And everyone kind of has their reasons, whether it's, the police feel like they're not being respected, or members of the community feel like the police are not serving and protecting the way they should. And one of the things that you point out is that the attitude, in a way, when it comes to police and politics has shifted. That once upon a time, if a mayor was going to come out against a police department, they were probably taking their political career in their own hands because the unions are so powerful. But now there is a national conversation about, the ways in which policing needs to change to make it work better. And there's kind of like a word that comes up in your article over and over again, and it has to do with resentment, that there's kind of like a lot of bad blood.
Yeah, definitely. The politics are very complicated now because, as you point out, on the one hand, there is now a real constituency in a lot of these cities, kind of an activist liberal constituency for serious police reform, even so-called defunding of the police. But at the same time, you also have a lot of people in the communities that are most affected by violent crime that are actually wary of some of this talk of defunding police and are pushing back on it because they are very aware of just how bad the violence is in their community and how much they do depend on police, however imperfect, to help with that. What you hear from these communities is we want both. We want police that are constitutional and that are not harassing us and are being fair, but at the same time, police that are actually policing our streets and catching the guys who are doing the shooting and the killing. So it's a very complex political picture that these mayors are having to negotiate.
I mean, at one point in the article, I think it might be Baltimore. Sorry, Vlad. I think it might be Baltimore, but you can correct me, Alec. That you talk about sort of small-time street drug dealers that are kind of upset at the fact that they're not seeing the same level of police presence because even they want some sort of level of stability, I guess, on the streets.
Definitely. I mean, that quote came from 2015 after Freddie Gray's death, and what we saw then was just that it was really just a complete void. There was such a dramatic reduction in police presence, and so you had just this real sense of anything goes, essentially, where you had drug crews able to take new corners, settle scores with a real sense of impunity, and then suddenly you had 45 murders per month in the months following Freddie Gray's death. It was just astonishing and terrible. Another element of this that is so important is it's not just the police pulling back that leads to these rise in violence, but it's also the community pulling back in a sense where where there's such a loss in trust of the police following one of these high-profile incidents of police violence, that the community becomes less likely to cooperate, basically, to call in tips, to report a crime, to testify in court, and that's such a huge element of this also, that there's just this you really depend on that trust.
And Alex, I guess one of the things that, I know you looked at policing across the country, and you've no doubt seen in recent days that heinous act that happened out in Los Angeles, where a gunman opened fire onto Los Angeles sheriff's deputies, wounding them, and then you had people outside the hospital, saying terrible, horrific things about those police officers who were fighting for their lives. And I'm curious about, specifically in New York City, I've done some reporting on, prior to all of this, on what the police was doing to strengthen the community, the ties with the community. A lot of the officers that I spoke to lived close to or not far from some of the communities that they patrolled. I guess when police departments invest in that, and the community in return also invest in trying to understand the police perspective, does that all get eroded? Has that all been eroded in the last couple of months, over the last year? Or is there still something left to salvage? And perhaps it happens when there's a new mayor, if that's what it comes to at the end of the day.
It's not beyond hope, really. I mean, we've seen examples around the country of places where you really have had sort of a long-term improvement in relations. One example that's often cited is actually L.A. That L.A. Building from the horror of the Rodney King incident in the early '90s and the riots there, was able to really reform that department and drive down huge reductions in violent crime in L.A. and really improve police community relations there. Another example is actually Chicago. Crazy as it may be to invoke Chicago now, after the shooting of Laquan McDonald back in 2015, 2016, in that range, they had huge increases in crime, also a very clear example of this kind of effect. But then in the years following that, there was a real concerted effort between the police and the community to sort of build things back up, and you saw massive declines in crime, violent crime, in Chicago. Unfortunately, this summer, Chicago, along with so many other cities, is really going through a pretty terrible spike.
Yeah, certainly. Alec MacGillis, thank you so much. The article's a really good read. Sit down, give yourself some extra time, but it's really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.